I recently read about a survey that was done in Russia that found that 58% of Russians supported the country's invasion of Ukraine. The figure came from a phone survey conducted by Russian researchers who wished to remain anonymous, in which they polled about 1,600 adults from around the country. And according to the Washington Post, about 46% of respondents said they firmly supported the action, and 13% said they somewhat supported it. Roughly 23% opposed the operation, and 13% had no opinion or declined to answer. About 6% said they were on the fence. Among young people, support for the war is significantly lower, according to the study. In the 18 to 24 age group, 29% indicated they backed the war, while 39% were opposed. Peak support for the war at 75% was among respondents aged 66 and older. Fewer than half of respondents who live in cities of more than 1 million people, 48%, supported the invasion. A higher proportion of Russians who reported that their personal finances had improved or remained steady in the past year backed the war, compared with respondents who said their financial situation had worsened. I found all of this really interesting considering that just after the survey was conducted, Russia passed several laws threatening jail time of up to 15 years for things like spreading false information about the invasion of Ukraine, which includes criticizing the war. Hell, that actually even includes calling it a war because Russia insists on calling this a special military operation. Surely, even before those laws were passed, people living in such an anti-free speech autocracy wouldn't necessarily respond truthfully to a stranger calling them up and asking their opinions, right? This is actually a common problem in research that requires people to self-report their own opinions or behaviors. If the topic is anything sensitive, from asking how often a person masturbates, to whether or not they've stolen office supplies, to whether or not they think there is currently a war happening between Russia and Ukraine, people tend to lie. And so researchers need to come up with ways to either get them to tell the truth or at least detect the lies. A lot of that just boils down to how you ask the questions. There are reams of data showing how seemingly small decisions about survey design can impact responses. As an example, Pew Research points out that after the 2008 presidential election, people responded very differently to two versions of the question. What one issue mattered most to you in deciding how you voted for president? One was closed-ended and the other open-ended. In the closed-ended version, respondents were provided 5 options and could volunteer an option that was not on the list. When explicitly offered the economy as a response, more than half of respondents, 58%, chose this answer. Only 35% of those who responded to the open-ended version volunteered the economy. Moreover, among those asked the closed-ended version, fewer than 1 in 10, 8%, provided a response other than the 5 they were read. By contrast, fully 43% of those asked the open-ended version provided a response not listed in the closed-ended version of the question. All of the other issues were chosen at least slightly more often when explicitly offered in the closed-ended version than in the open-ended version. Similarly, Pew found that back in 2003, people were more likely to favor allowing gays and lesbians to enter into legal agreements that give them the same rights as married couples when this question was asked after one about whether they favored or opposed allowing gays and lesbians to marry. And those surveys were conducted here in the United States, where we're only like a little bit autocratic and overwhelmed with biased propaganda. In the case of Russians answering questions about their own autocratic leaders' actions, there's a chance that no matter how well you design your questions and your surveys, many people are still going to lie, right? So I was a bit skeptical of whether or not, as that Russian survey found, 58% of Russians agreed with the war in Ukraine. That's why I was delighted to stumble upon this project from Russian political activist Alexei Miniailo. He and his team of researchers conducted 2 phone surveys of about 1,800 subjects each and analyzed nearly 3 million Russian social media posts to compare what Russians were saying online versus what they were saying to surveyors. They reached several very interesting conclusions, including that, yes, Russians are lying to surveyors about their support for the war because they're scared to voice the wrong opinion and risk imprisonment, But how did the researchers figure that out? Now, I had previously heard of psychologists utilizing something called randomized response techniques, RRTs, to detect and account for lies in surveys. In fact, I first heard of this technique in Predictably Irrational, the book by Dan Ariely. In order to counteract dishonesty in one of his surveys, he had subjects flip a coin before answering a question with two responses, let's say yes or no. If the coin landed on heads, they were to answer honestly. And if it landed on tails, they should choose the yes option, whether that was true for them or not. Knowing that the rate of heads versus tails is always going to be around 50-50, he could then remove that noise of the tails in order to get a more honest tally of responses compared to if he had just directly asked the subjects to answer honestly. At the time, I found this technique absolutely fascinating. I'm like, wow, I can't believe that works. But upon remembering it this week, I had to pause a moment and reconsider. After all, Dan Ariely is the psychologist who just last year had a paper about honesty retracted due to accusations of fraud. So I did a little research on the use of randomized response techniques, and I found a very persuasive report published back in 2018 that found that across 9 experiments, the noise introduced by RRTs can make respondents concerned that innocuous responses will be interpreted as admissions, and as a result, yield prevalence estimates that are lower than direct questioning, less accurate than direct questioning, and even nonsensical. Well, I suppose it's a good thing then that Mini Ilo and his team did not use RRTs in order to try to detect deception. Some of the subjects they interviewed basically admitted they were lying, like a gentleman who said, well, you understand, if I say no, it will be provocative. So of course I will tell you it's a special military operation, because any other opinion can result in a criminal prosecution, and I don't want that. I mean, he didn't actually say that. I think he said it in Russian, but obviously I do not speak Russian. Other respondents, though, weren't quite so upfront, but the researchers could still figure out that they were lying. How? Back to question design. That's right. I was wrong. It turns out simple survey and question design can, even in this case, detect falsehoods. In one experiment, the researchers gave half the respondents yes or no options when answering whether they supported the war. The other half could respond yes, no, or I don't want to answer. They found that 70% of the yes-no group said they supported the war, but only 63% of the yes-no, I don't want to answer group supported the war, meaning that 7% in the former group were likely lying, probably because they were afraid. They also found that survey design showed evidence of lying. When respondents were asked if they support the war at the start of the poll, 62% said yes. When other people were asked at the end of the survey, about 4 minutes later, that figure jumped to 72%. Who said yes, they support the war. The researchers think that this can be explained by the fact that people got more nervous the longer the survey went on, which encouraged them to finally give the acceptable answer when that question was asked. The researchers also found that about 63% of respondents said they think the invasion is a special military operation and not a war. And they also suspect many of those respondents were lying. They came to that conclusion by comparing the answers to queries at the time on Russia's biggest search engine. War in Ukraine had more than 47 million queries, about 99.83%, while military operation in Ukraine had about 83,000 queries, 0.17%. So when they're looking up information, they're looking it up under war. They know it's a war. Even with trying to ferret out this dishonesty, the team still found a slight majority of Russians are in favor of the war, or say they're in favor of the war. The difference is that they provided a lot of extra context. More than 30% of respondents had positive, sympathetic views of Ukrainians, and only 2.4% voiced any kind of criticism or hostility towards Ukrainians. Much like that survey reported in the Washington Post, they did find 40% of Russians aged 18 to 29 are openly against the war, in part probably because young people are more likely to seek out alternative news sources besides the state-run media. Many of the older adults who were in favor of the war completely bought into the narrative that it was a special operation designed to remove Nazis from the Ukrainian government. They quote a 70-year-old woman from a rural village who said, "I am of the generation who worked with the Ukrainians. I respect them very much. We danced to Ukrainian dances, sang Ukrainian songs. I think highly of Ukraine, very highly. Believe it or not, nobody in Ukraine did me anything wrong. I pity our kids who are fighting now, the kids from both sides. My grandson is 20, my son is 43. I'm so very much afraid that they might get drafted if a war starts. And the Ukrainian nation has done nothing wrong, so I like them very much." And then the interviewer asks if she supports the ongoing military action. "Of course I do. Let them kick the Maideners out. Let the real Ukrainians live. The Ukrainian nation that we love, love, love. We do indeed. There is no such thing as a bad nation, only bad people. Let the government decide whether or not to support. It's not for me to answer. I say I am against wars, against from any side." So does a majority of the Russian citizenry support what Russia is doing in Ukraine? Probably not, if only for the major reason that they don't know what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And does the majority support any action in Ukraine, whether war or special military, whatever that they're told it is? That's tougher to say, maybe. As long as Putin threatens to imprison people for voicing their dissent, we'll never really know how people feel. In the meanwhile, I love that Russian researchers are working so hard to separate fact from fiction, to add important context to otherwise depressing data, and to figure out the best ways to get through the veil of censorship in order to reach their fellow country people.